and it is on building community resilience by scaling up women's access to technologies and strengthening voice and leadership. Thank you for joining us today to discuss how we can enhance women's role in resilience building and in particular, their access to climate-smart technologies, which provide significant opportunities for women's empowerment. This panel is a joint effort of UN Women and UN Environment Programme under the Empower project funded by the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA. It is no news to anyone that Asia Pacific is one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change impacts. We also know that climate change has disproportionate impacts on women and girls. To respond to the challenge posed by climate change, Empower builds the capacities of women, women entrepreneurs, civil society organizations, and government agencies to respond to climate change in a gender-responsive manner. The project supports national and regional climate policy developments, but at its core are women, women leaders, and entrepreneurs who are supported to gain better access to technologies and other resources that are needed for resiliency. Improving women's access to climate-smart technologies and solutions and women's empowerment in climate change are especially critical now as countries recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. The drawbacks in gender equality, the pandemic have caused increasingly call for inclusive and empowering approach for building back more equal and building back better, not forgetting the implementation of climate change adaptation and mitigation actions that would take into account the disproportionate impact of climate change and the pandemic on women and girls in our region. We know that a gender perspective and ultimately gender equality is key in building climate resilience, but how do these efforts and practices look like on the ground? How can we measure success and who will bring the stories and experiences further? This session will provide the audience with tangible and concrete experiences of the value of gender-responsive measures on resilience building through access to technology and enhanced voice and leadership, and show evidence on what difference a gender perspective can make to climate-resilient development and addressing the socio-economic impacts of COVID-19. Our panelists will bring the perspectives of government, civil society, and journalism and media to discuss these issues. Before we dive into the important discussion with the top experts, I would like us all to enjoy a 2-minute video that is brand new, and it is produced by UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, and under the Empower project, and it's titled The Letter. It will set the scene for the discussion and show us how women's leadership and innovation can amplify our climate action and build a better future. So let us enjoy the video. such a hopeful and optimistic video. Kudos to you, our UNEP colleagues. I would like now to give the floor to our welcome speaker and long-term partner in climate change and gender equality, Ms. Osa Hiden. Osa is the regional head of development cooperation for Asia and the Pacific, based in Bangkok. Previously, you were the director for Middle East, Asia, and humanitarian assistance at SIDA headquarters. You're a development and a management expert for over 20 years of experience in both bilateral and multilateral development. You really have extensive knowledge of human rights and democracy, environment, and cooperation with the private sector. You did work in Asia and you still work in Asia, but you also spent a long time in China. You worked in Latin America, you worked in Africa, and you have a long experience in partner-driven cooperation. In addition, you were also a UN colleague at a certain point working with UNESCO in Paris. Osa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for the introduction, and thank you for the inspirational video we saw. Thank you, UNEP, for producing that. And thank you for inviting me for the opening remarks to this important session on building community resilience by scaling up women's access to technologies and strengthening voice and leadership. We also recognize that the Asia-Pacific Adaptation Network is an important regional platform for adaptation knowledge and mobilization in the Asia-Pacific region. As Mohammed said, we know that Asia-Pacific is one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change impacts and disasters in the world. The region accounts for more than 90% of all global deaths from disasters, where 70% of disasters are climate related. We also know that women and girls and persons with disabilities and other marginalized groups suffer disproportionately from the impacts of climate change and disasters. The lack of adequate and equal access to essential resources, such as land, water, finance, information, technology, and energy, make women vulnerable to climate change and undermine their capacity to adapt. But women are also very important agents of change who possesses knowledge and experiences that is critical to drive the agenda forward for sustainable development. Gender equality is therefore central in strengthening people's resilience and to ensure sustainability of climate actions. So addressing climate change, a regional approach is important. Likewise, gender equality and human rights are cornerstones. On a broader scale, we know this, but when it comes to being specific about the risks in specific contexts, we lack the sex, age, and disability disaggregated data that we need. Further, climate action and disaster risk reduction in general is not listening to and learning from the people at most risk. The people with the most to lose are rarely invited to the table, let alone heard. This narrative needs, of course, to be changed. As many of you know, the Swedish government is a feminist government, and Sweden has a feminist foreign policy. We normally talk about the 3 R's, the rights and respect for human rights and the rule of law, really constitutes a role in every discussion on gender. And this, of course, also includes the promotion of the full enjoyment of human rights by all women and girls, including by combating all forms of violence and discrimination that restricts their freedom of action. We also talk about representation, that women must have equal access to participation and influence in decision-making at all levels and in all areas. We talk about resources and the equal rights to available resources. All of Sweden's development cooperation should also have a human rights-based approach. And with this, we mean the importance of participation, the link to human rights systems, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and transparency. Sweden is a proud donor of Empower project, which is an important collaboration between the UN Women and UNEP. And we see that Empower really materializes Sweden's priorities on environment and climate, gender equality, and human rights. Thank you again for inviting us and me, and we're really looking forward to a very interesting session, and welcome all.
Thank you so much, Åsa, for your welcome remarks and for your very solid partnership all along. It has been unwavering. Our next speaker is Professor Joya Sri Roy, who is the inaugural Bangabandhu Chair Professor at Asian Institute of Technology, AIT, in Thailand. Professor Roy is also with the Department of Economics at the Jadavpur University and the founding advisor of the Global Change Program at the Roichi Sasakawa Young Leaders Fellowship Fund. Professor Roy has an outstanding career in the academia, and she was in the IPCC 2007 Nobel Peace Prize winning panel and is coordinating lead author in 5th and 6th assessment cycle of the Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, focusing on climate change mitigation. She has published more than 125 peer-reviewed journal articles, authored and edited books about economics of climate change and pollution, energy demand and policy, valuation of natural resources and environmental services, water and sustainable development, just to mention a few of Professor Roy's accomplishments. I would like to ask Professor Roy to take the floor for the inspiring opening speech. Professor Roy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And I really appreciate the organizers for putting women's leadership and voices at the core of the resilience building discourse, because this changes framing women's agency as change makers rather than as a victim, which was a traditional approach. So you end up with compensation, but you are never in the boardroom to make your decision hard. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. What I want to say is that we know that when we are talking about this resilience, it is about resilience building with the changing climate. So since we know that ever since IPCC special report on 1.5 degree could state with more scientific evidence that we all are now living in a 1 degree warmer world than pre-industrial society. And the scientific evidences are also building up to attribute many of these impacts in various parts of the world to these climate changes. So it is now an accepted fact that we need to change framing our space of developmental discourse and actions and the processes by which we delivered these. The good news is, I always say that the world leaders also acknowledged these impending changes in 3 major global declarations in 2015. And all 3 actually targets 2030. So it's just this decade long action now that how we can set the development agenda on the right track, in the sense that when we talk of right track, what do we mean by that? So it has been acknowledged globally that the Sustainable Development Goal Framework is providing us the 7 developmental goals, which needs to be achieved in tandem in a time-bound manner where no one is left behind. This is very important, that no one is left behind. I'll come back to this a little later, right? So the second thing is that the Paris framework provides us scope to revisit human actions so that climate change can be stabilized and also that the sustainable development is achieved. And the third one is about the disaster risk reduction in the Sendai framework. So all three actually talks of people. And if we are talking of people, then we know now it is globally accepted that no one should be left behind. So this is very important so far as women agenda are concerned, because 50% of the global population are women. And the caution that we need to have on this new path of development is that historical development path has actually left women behind. And so we have now dual responsibility to see women can be the change maker and also can catch up with new changes without falling in the trap of widening gap. So the discourse needs to be around how do we build this resilience? That means how do we live with ongoing and impending changes? First is that we need to know what are these changes to which we need to get along with. So we need more information. And so this 50% of the people who are women, they need this information that what is this change which is going to happen? Of course, this is happening at the UN level, at the research level, but it has to go to the ground level, who will be really making the change in their own lifestyle and in the community lifestyle and family lifestyle and overall national changes. So we need to know that, so in that case, once you give the information, second question comes, how do we know that if I have a capacity to deal with the change and maintain my operations and functions? So what are my operations and how in the changed world my operations will be changing? I need to understand that. And I need to have an option to make choices. Once we have the capacity and the option to make choice, then we can say that we are resilient. Now the question is, no individual, not to talk of woman, has an agency by herself or himself to build resilience, unless there are enabling environments within which they work. Clearly, four things matter: technology that facilitates functionality, the infrastructure. So one needs to have facility, access to technology, infrastructure, information, and training to build the necessary individual skill. I'll just give very simple example from my own life. How did I stay resilient? Because I can claim that I was resilient during a pandemic, because it was, of course, I had the accumulated knowledge and skill and science and my profession in which I am in. So on research and teaching. But when I'm in Asian Institute of Technology now, the question comes, I could not have been resilient and could not have remained functional unless the institution had taken a very, positive vision about changing the technology very quickly and providing the infrastructure to the faculties to deliver the service online. And that was also preceded by a training and information giving. So institution has a very, very important role to provide that technology, infrastructure, and training, so that given my capacity, I can top up and then I can stay resilient. So I take this example from my life, and then I say that it is really what matters is how the institution, how the investment, and how the training are imparted so that one can maintain the functionality to remain resilient in any kind of change. So if I can give on examples that how in different countries such institutional arrangements, infrastructure arrangements have been made to empower women to become resilient. Just to give one small example, let's say in Bangladesh, the institutional arrangement was made such that any woman, if they have a bank account in their own individual name, then they get a higher rate of interest, which gives them empowerment and gives access to finance. So in India, when the LPG was given to all the women rural women, in 4 years' time, this could be achieved because there was a huge institutional arrangement made and was targeted to women. So targeting women for providing capacity and option to become resilient is very important, and training at the ground level. I really appreciate Empower for taking up this project, and which I know they are including all these components in their project. I really wish to see these become a daily discourse for everybody so that we know and everybody is informed what they need to know, and that we put pressure on the institutions that what kind of infrastructure, what kind of capacity, and what kind of access is needed for women to be a part of the change maker. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Roy, for these inspiring words. And now to the exciting panel. The moderator of the panel today is Ms. Nadia Hutagalong. Nadia Hutagalong is a sustainability icon and household name on television across Asia. I think we all know that. Ms. Hutagalong spoke at her first conservation forum in 1996 and has used her platform to be one of the most established environmental advocates ever since. In 2006, she founded Green Kampong, a resource for green living. In 2014, she launched the Let Elephants Be Elephants campaign with a documentary to reduce the demand for ivory in Asia on National Geographic and Nat Geo Wild. In 2015, she addressed the United Nations General Assembly to mark World Wildlife Day in New York alongside Chelsea Clinton, and was the global ambassador for WWF's Earth Hour for 7 years. Ms. Hutagalong serves on the board of the Green School for 5 years. In 2019, Nadia launched a campaign in collaboration with Pangaya to raise awareness and funds for the Sumatran elephants and orangutans. 2020 saw Ms. Hutagalong start We the Good, a campaign focusing on migrant workers, mental well-being, and individuals and families at risk. Ms. Hutagalong serves as advisor to the Contentment Foundation, which provides scientifically evidenced, philosophically grounded practices that promote safe, healthy school climates. Ms. Hutagalong strongly believes that our inner well-being directly relates to moving from apathy to empathy and into action. Before I give the floor to Ms. Hutagalong to moderate the rest of the event, I would like to thank you once more for joining, and I wish you an inspiring and thought-provoking panel discussion. Nadia, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. That was a very long version of my bio there that you had, but thank you.
Important one, though.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much, Professor Joyeshi, for a really educational and very informative sharing that you shared with us all here. Now, I'd like to welcome all of the audience right now to the panel discussion, where we will discuss how we can build community resilience by scaling up women's access to technologies and strengthening voice and leadership. And if you would like to ask a question to the speakers, please use the chat function and I will facilitate to the panelists, and we will also be having a Q&A session at the end of the panel discussion. But do, feel free to raise your hands with any questions already during the panel discussion. Now, I'm going to be introducing our speakers, but do know that on our APAN website and also in the link shared in the chat box, you can read a lot more about these distinguished speakers that will be sharing here with us today. First up, we have Buena Bernal. She is CNA's correspondent based in the Philippines, who has worked for CNN International Asia Pacific, Al Jazeera in English, and many more. In her media career, she has focused on the underreported and has immersed herself in the daily lives of deep sea fishermen of sashimi-grade tuna, tobacco farmers, sugar plantation workers, and different tribes across the three main island groups of the Philippines. Next, we have Mr. Van An, who has more than 20 years experience in development programs in Vietnam, focusing on sustainable livelihoods, climate change adaptation, and women's empowerment, especially for ethnic minority women. He is managing the implementation of Empower, and together with UNEP, they support the women's use of renewable energy to increase adaptive capacity and enhance climate resilient livelihoods. Next, we have Soma Datta. Soma is an expert on gender, poverty, and the development in the context of energy access, and is a senior technical advisor of Energia, the international network on gender and sustainable energy, where she set up and led the scaling up energy access through women's economic empowerment, or WE. Soma is a member of the technical working group of the UN High-Level Dialogue. So I welcome all of our panelists today. I'm sure it's going to be a very, very rich and informative conversation. So I'm really looking forward to it. Now, COVID is having tremendous impact on people's livelihoods, especially in the most marginalized communities who are already suffering from the effects of climate change. Now, in the first round of questions, we will learn more about the ongoing challenges, the gaps, and the opportunities. First up, Soma, with your experience in implementing programs to support women in accessing renewable energy, when it comes to data and the understanding of gendered impacts of climate change, what do we know about women's access to climate smart technologies and renewable energy, and what kind of data and information are we missing? And can it tell us something on how COVID-19 is affecting our women folk?
Thank you, Nadia. Let me begin by thanking the organizers, of course, and also take a moment to introduce Energia, which is an international network. It's an informal network working with issues of gender equality and energy access. So whether it is clean cooking, women's entrepreneurship, employment, leadership in energy sector remains very central to our existence. And it was set up in 1996, and it has currently 36 partners in 18 countries. So just jumping to the questions then, what do we know about women's access to energy and climate technologies? Well, we do know for sure that women gain tremendously for renewable energy services. That's very well established, whether it is in homes, whether it is workplaces, in terms of reducing time in the chores that women are expected to do, mainly largely because of the cultural traditions that we have, whether it's fuel wood collection, whether it is water collection, all of these. It also helps tremendously to increase their productivity and profits in their enterprises, and by what is called productive use of energy. We also know at the same time that in addition to gaining, they also have a very strong role to play in the dissemination and adoption of energy technologies. And we've seen this in multiple countries, in multiple projects. And, we have a large number of organizations like Delight, we have EcoZoom in Africa, Closer Home in India, we have Dharma Life. All of these are working with a large number of women's enterprises at the grassroots levels because of their networking skills, because of the kind of skills they have in terms of reaching other women and reaching very remote communities, like leaving no one behind is very central to the SDGs, and that's something where women can play a strong role. There are several reasons why this makes sense. And there are several pro-development, social gains that can be achieved by engaging women. I won't go into that for the moment. What do we not know? That was the second question. So like I said, in energy access, we know women, gain tremendously and can contribute tremendously. But the data we have, the data systems we have on SDGs, let's say on energy access, gives us binary data on 2 indicators. So whether it is access to electricity or it is access to clean cooking, we have data on whether a household has it or doesn't have it. It is not disaggregated by sex. It doesn't say much on adoption, use of the energy services. In India, for instance, right now, we have a very large number of people who've gained access to LPG, but we've had a recent slip back in terms of usage. Now, this doesn't get captured by the normal binary data. It also doesn't recognize the kinds of higher order benefits that we have from energy services. As you know, energy is a golden thread. You don't need energy for energy service. You need it for lighting, you need it for making money, etc., etc. So all of these higher order gains do not get captured in the kind of binary data that we have. So this is a major gap that we have, that we are not really capturing the information on everything that energy services can do, whether it is also increase in family income, well-being, children's health, education. All of these are catalyzed through energy services, but we don't have data on that. So that, I would say, is one major gap in terms of data and information. COVID has, I think there is plenty of data that shows that COVID is likely to push back close to 45 to 50 million women into extreme poverty, which itself is very worrying. And but also in terms of energy access, like I said, households are being pushed back to, they're being pushed back to biomass use and giving up LPG. They're being forced to cut back electricity uses. All of these has tremendous impacts on women. As far as women's businesses are concerned in the energy sector, Energia did an assessment, a small survey covering 6,000 women entrepreneurs in Nepal, Kenya, Nigeria, and a couple of other countries. And we found that most of
Sorry, Soma, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but your voice is very, very low. Maybe just bring your mic up to your face a little closer, because your information is so valuable. We don't want to miss it. I'm catching just bits of it, so I want to ensure that we can hear you well. Thank you so much.
Okay. So what I was saying is that Energia, is it better now?
Yes, better now. Thank you.
Okay. So what I was saying is that Energia conducted this survey of women entrepreneurs in last year in 2020, and we found that within 3 months of the pandemic, more than 50% of the entrepreneurs had lost their business completely. They were not able to switch to digital media. They were not able to get access to relief packages. So which just goes to prove that when we have, now that the countries are on a recovery path, then these realities of women not being able to gain from women actually having lost their livelihoods must be built into it. The fact that houses, homes have turned into not just schools and colleges, but also workplaces, and women are having to do work so much more than before. I'm sure this resonates with all the women in this audience and participants here, that must be addressed. So I would say that's how COVID is affecting women. And I will stop here for the moment. Nadia, back to you.
Thank you so much, Soma. Some of those numbers are indeed quite sobering, and they are numbers that we need to be acutely aware of as we move into trying to respond. Next, we have Van An, who is the director of CHASE, the Center of Help for Indigenous Value Promotion and Sustainable Environment in Vietnam. Now, learning a little bit more about the realities on the ground related to climate change, but also the ongoing pandemic, I turn to Van An. Now, what are the specific challenges that women and the communities in Vietnam are facing during the pandemic, in addition to the effects of climate change? And as you are working specifically with Indigenous communities, do you see any particular challenges that is quite unique or to these groups? Yeah.
Thank you, Nadia. I think the topic is very interesting, and it really fit to our nature of work. Yes, we spent a lot of time during the last 20 years working with ethnic minority. Maybe I would like to take the last point first. Is about how the indigenous community in Vietnam, that's the ethnic minority, challenges, their challenges in general in poverty reduction. Yes, you may know that during the last 10 years, Vietnam have achieved a good poverty reduction. The poverty rate in Vietnam reduced from 58% in 1990 to 14% in the year 2008, and nowadays in the year 2017-18, it's around 7%. However, Vietnam's effort in poverty reduction facing a number of challenges. One of the most critical things is that ethnic minority remain as the poorest group in Vietnam. And the gap between the majority, that's the king group, and ethnic minority continue to widen. So in Vietnam, ethnic minority people account for only 15% of the national population. But year 2012, for example, the poverty of ethnic minority 47%. So now in 2017 and 2018, the poverty rate of ethnic minority account for more than 50%. That's 52.7%. That means the gap between the majority and ethnic minority is continued to widen. But the poverty nowadays in ethnic minority is not only limited to the food security, economic, but all aspects of their life. For example, including health, education, access to water, service, technology, response to climate change, and natural disaster. So among different underlying causes of poverty for EM in Vietnam, such as constraint to access to good quality of services, limited access to economic and barrier to market, and limited access to agriculture welfare service, the social exclusion and gender inequality are considered as the key driver of persistent poverty of ethnic minority in Vietnam. So the social and cultural practice and also irrelevant policy mechanism is related to it compound the situation of women and girl ethnic minority. For example, the female worker ethnic minority have slightly unskilled, untrained, and limited information, technology, and practice. So their leadership also not recognized and promoted by community and at policy level. So women have a fewer opportunity to access to technology and training, and they often be many housework, and they have less right to participate in decision making at a community and also at higher level of policy level. For example, in our survey under the Empower program, in 2019, the women ethnic minority, they account for 80% of agricultural labor in the 2 provinces that we conduct research, but only 3% of them received training during the last 3 years. 80% of the labor and 3% got only 1 or 2 training during the last 3 years. So you can see that very poor access to capacity building and training and also other services that needed for their livelihood and that needed for their decision-making process. So Vietnam also very vulnerable to climate change effect. in Vietnam, actually quite a lot of effort have been given to address climate change at different level, but most of effort pay attention on the sea and lowland level, where ethnic minority, especially women and girls, is the most vulnerable in front of the climate change. And not much attention based on mountainous area where all the ethnic minority live isolated and alone to fight against the climate change impact on their agriculture activity and other income activity. So for example, all the processing and harvesting product in the mountain area in ethnic minority done by women, but they find very difficult to find relevant technique or processing technique to do with their agriculture product. Our survey under the Empower program in Bắc-Cạn, they show that 40% of area, their agriculture lost or damaged because the weather, the climate change, and unskilled trained and unrelevant technology for processing and driving. So related to that general picture, you may guess that they get quite a lot of serious impact related to COVID-19, because in Vietnam, it may a little bit different from other countries that during the time of COVID-19, everybody, not only the city, but also in the remote area, have to do social distancing and quite a lot of limit from the policy. I think one side is good and other side is that it seriously affects the production of ethnic minority. The fact is that the ethnic minority women there, their production and income is very small. And then with the one case of economic shock, it will take a long time and with a lot of effort to recover. So under the research from the Empower program during the time of COVID-19, we find out that all the EM women with the micro and small medium enterprise have a decreased their daily income from 50 to 60%. For some service related to service, for example, if they're selling their agriculture product in the street, they reduce nearly 100% of their income during the COVID-19 place. So the main reason is the demand for their goods and service and the lack of access to supplier for their business. So a large majority of women have a not formally registered as business. So if they not, because they not really formally registered as a business, they will not receive some support from government for business during the time of COVID-19. So I mean that they are more vulnerable to the formal business in the lowland level. So it's also related to women and girls that increase in time spent for unpaid and domestic and care work. So there are serious gender inequity in terms of who helping the woman with the unpaid work to care domestic work during time of COVID-19. Our research realized that around 50% report that yes, they receive some support with the household work from the husband. The rest, 60%, they have to manage themselves, or they said that we receive support from daughter. So again, daughter also the woman and girl, again, all the unpaid work finally come back to the woman.
And thank you so much. You have a whole wealth of knowledge and experience, through your engaging directly with the community on the ground in Vietnam. And I wish we could allow for more sharing from your side, but I need to be a little bit conscious of time and create space or leave space for some of our other speakers. Thank you so much for your sharing. And we will come back to you because I'm hearing a lot of what the problem is. And I'd love to hear about some of your best practices and how you're moving into finding the solutions a little bit later on. Next up, we have Buena Bernal, Philippines correspondent at Channel News Asia. Now, turning to Buena, I'd love to hear your thoughts as a journalist on how we can better tell the stories on women's experiences and leadership in climate-related technology sectors. And also, in your view, what influence can storytelling have on decision makers, and what are the key challenges or success factors for finding such stories?
Well, the power of storytelling is a given, but I do have to say as a caveat that the impact of stories exists only if these are stories that are told well, especially for stories about nature and elements of nature that do not have the ability to speak. So when you're telling stories about mitigation measures, adaptation technology, what you're doing is really bridging the gap between the climate policy bubble and the general public. These are jargon-heavy topics. And when you explain this to the general public, what you're doing is generating empathy for the natural world. And that takes nuanced storytelling. That involves going back to root causes, focusing on impact, adding the perspective of the disadvantaged. And strong storytelling means stories that have solid premises. This will appeal to your average reasonable person. So when you talk about solid premises on your reporting, you need baseline information, and data is crucial to that. We already discussed here how the effect of climate change varies vastly depending on your circumstances, whether you're in a rural or urban setting, or whatever factors you were born into. So disaggregated data, whether that is based on sex, age, disability, is important for these solid premises on our storytelling. But important as well to amplify women's voices and female leaders' voices is actual human experiences. So we need to showcase the full spectrum of how women are affected by climate change disproportionately. And that will make the audience understand that women leaders are best positioned to address these gaps. So for example, we need to go out of our way to tell stories about how women are the ones fetching water during drought, how the lack of alternative power sources in rural areas that are off-grid would affect pregnant women about to go on labor, for example, or even more simply, this discussion on integrating climate change into the students' curriculum, how it's actually the women of the household, more often than not, assisting children in their remote learning right now. So good storytelling, solid premises, and integrating the perspective of the disadvantaged must be there. But more than any of that, in terms of success factors, I think the single most important success factor when you talk about climate change stories and women's stories in the media is newsroom management. One that is effective, sensitive as well, that understands the importance of stories about climate change. Reporters take the cue from editorial management. So for example, when you have newsroom decisions like dedicating a climate change correspondent, or how newsroom has a dedicated section for climate change stories, or how a newsroom allocates time and resources for special reports about climate change and resilience, then you can see that the newsroom values this topic. So I think that's one important success factor there. But it'll also be helpful for civil society organizations and corporations, pitching stories to newsrooms to know that not only do reporters take their cue from editorial management, but the newsroom and the reporters are at the beck and call of news cycles. So that is just part of the job. So the question is, how do we make sure that even the chaos of one deadline after another of chasing news in its traditional sense, and that is a recent event that matters to people, for example, the vaccination rollout in different countries, election, mass protests, that even in the middle of all these, and there's no shortage of such news events, that we still report on stories that are not necessarily the major event of the week, but matters to humanity, such as climate change and women's issues. So a personal example of this that I can point most recently is, for example, the unprecedented flooding that happened in the Philippines late last year. We saw unprecedented flooding in Cagayan Valley, that's north of Manila. late last year, and also flooding we haven't seen since 2009 in Marikina City in the eastern part of Metro Manila. And news crews were deployed to cover that event, right? So that was the news cycle of the week, maybe 2 weeks. But after that, news crews moved on to another news cycle. So it's easy to forget the issue. And what I decided to do was to not move on, basically, and to ask myself what was behind the flooding. And even weeks after the flooding, we did a special report on how the Philippines denuded forests, or basically upstream areas such as river basins that are supposed to hold water, to hold flood water, were already denuded, and that caused that flooding in the downstream areas, and unfortunately, it claimed a lot of lives. So we went to the forest, we covered the area, and we saw a lot of remnants of charcoal making, for example. We saw how forest rangers were on confrontation with armed guards, for example, trying to encroach that protected area. But we also went downstream, and that is to talk to people affected, to the human experience of the flooding, because it'll be very hard to explain, the importance of the natural world upstream without looking at the impact. And this is where I met a mother named Jean Flores, who said that what the flooding did was really destroy all the equipment of her children for remote learning. So their laptop, their iPad, their cell phones were destroyed by the flooding, and that it would take 6 months of her husband's salary to recover what they lost. So allowing these types of special reports on forests, wetlands, wildlife, tributaries, even in the middle of what's hot and sensational at the moment, whatever is the news cycle of that week is really a function of effective and sensitive newsroom management. So to complement that, at the same time, showing how the damage to the natural capital affects women disproportionately is a crucial complement to newsroom management that the reporter or storyteller also brings to the table. So it's two sides of the coin.
Thank you so much, Buena. I really would like to thank you for your deep curiosity in going behind the news, because these are the stories that really matter, really looking at the interconnectedness of all things and understanding the real reason behind we're experiencing these natural disasters. So congratulations to you and your teams for doing that extra work there. I'd now like to go back to our second round of questions. And in these questions, I'd like to ask our panelists to share their experiences and good practices and what we can learn from this, and what are some great examples that we can take away and maybe others can implement in their own lives and fields as well. First, I'd like to tap into Soma. Now, looking at the example of Van Ant's work in Vietnam, and how do we better present the link between women's leadership, access to climate smart technologies, and community resilience. So what are your experiences on women's leadership, and how can the sex disaggregated data support us in measuring the impact and result of our interventions?
Thank you, Nadia.
Soma, please lift up your mic so we can hear you. Thank you so much.
All
Thank
right.
you.
So let me just start by saying that in Energia's experience and in other organizations' experience too, we've seen that when women are economically empowered, it almost always leads to social empowerment. So we do see a lot of leadership happening, and also the fact that women do a great job in bolstering each other up and supporting each other up. So you have one leader and you immediately have a woman supporting many other women. And a small example of this is I'd like to give from Nepal, where we were working in one of the remote districts which didn't even have a distribution network for improved cook stoves. And one local, very enterprising woman called Neeru Shrestha, she started a stoves business. And the first thing she did after setting up the business was to employ 20 other women as last mile distributors. Now, this in itself doesn't sound like much, but when you think of the fact that these women get a chance to get some employment without traveling out too much, and most importantly, without making an investment of their own, they are able to actually get into the dissemination of cook stoves. And as they grow, they oftentimes they start their own distributors. So this sort of thing we've also seen in Africa, in a number of countries, women supporting each other. So, a couple of things that work very well in terms of good practices and women's leadership is firstly, women's what they call sisterhoods, working through women's groups. And of course, you have to be very careful in the kinds of groups you work with, but women working in groups, especially in disaster conditions where they're vulnerable and when they're afraid to sort of stand up on their own and make investment, works really, really well. The second point I want to make is that leadership doesn't come on its own. So when you do an enterprise development program or any other development program for that matter, you have to actually build in a component of leadership development into programming itself. And the third point I want to highlight is the importance of mentorship. So, when women get into businesses, we have to understand that they're mostly very vulnerable businesses and they need a friend and a guide to work with them throughout. So, a mentor who may be a technology mentor, a business mentor, but who supports them through this process of growing up, of becoming economically empowered, really works. So, these are three good practices that we've seen that work well. I'll stop there, I think.
Thank you so much, Soma. When coming back to the importance of narratives and storytelling, we know that local stories and journalism can change narratives on how women are portrayed in the male-dominated technology sectors. So what is your role as a journalist, and what can other journalists learn from you about setting a good example of when a narrative has changed the gender norms in relation to climate change and renewable energy?
Well, from my experience, it's not really that single story that's changing gender norms or challenging gender norms. It's more of the women themselves, their stories. It's not my script per se. It's actually the subject. Let me give you examples of women leaders in this sector that I've recently interviewed. So I recently spoke with Dr. Teresa Mondita Lim, who is the executive director of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity. This wonderful woman in science, talking to me about the Dasgupta review, how our premium on growth has really caused us damage to our natural capital, and how this can be applied in ASEAN. And I was really struck by her premium on collaboration, how she highlighted the importance of collaboration among the ASEAN member states, saying that it's important for us to get a baseline assessment on the carrying capacity of the region, on how much development the protected areas of ASEAN can absorb. And this great woman in STEM was basically saying to me, we need more science. And I think this is a demonstrative trait of female leaders that I've seen, their emphasis on collaboration. They're more sensitive to a wide range of issues, and they're able to create these meaningful changes in their organization. So I think highlighting women like that with female leaders in this sector, celebrating them is important, because that opportunity that they have, what they're really doing is paving the way for other women to also be given that opportunity. Let me tell you more about other stories or women I've been inspired by in recent stories I did and I'm still doing right now. So the story on denuded forests, I told you about the impact on that on a mother downstream, but upstream actually, that conservation project here in the Philippines called the Masumi Geo Reserve is co-led by a woman named Ando Malyang, this small-built female leader who's also basically doing what the forest rangers are doing. They're confronting these tall armed guards who are encroaching in the protected area in the Sierra Madre, which is a key biodiversity area here in the Philippines. So women are doing the work on the ground and they're providing solutions. You know, I've spoken with an architect, for example, who wants to go by the name Architect Joan, who's basically doing this alternative plan for a city north of Manila, so that that city can expand a major road without actually cutting down the trees, because the road expansion would cost 259 trees to be cut down. And she's doing this pro bono. They're leading the way, they're providing solutions, they're doing work on the ground. And I think it's really important to destroy this illusion of equality, basically, you know, that gender-based discrimination is a thing of the past. You know, maybe in some places there's no more outright discrimination, but there's still structural unconscious bias. And that's the reason why we highlight female leaders as well, because when we hear things like, well, I've done this same, you know, what's so impressive about her, what we're really seeing there is a lack of acknowledgement of the intersections of disadvantage and the multiple layers of suffering that other segments of society have gone through that maybe you haven't, for whatever reason, you know, because of an inherent economic disadvantage or other factors you have no control over, or were born into. So this idea of inclusive resilience, this brand of sensitivity to marginalized sectors, including women, the idea that they are paying the heaviest price for the ills in society, including climate change, is good for humanity, but also good for policymakers in particular. And I think storytelling is a tool to generate that kind of empathy to the natural world and also to women.
Thank you very much. I very much agree, because storytelling is what shifts hearts and minds. And when you shift hearts and minds, then you can then foster more empathy and get people to move from a place of apathy to empathy and then into action. So for me, storytelling has always been so critical. And for people like yourself, or even for me, I think the role is really about telling the stories for those who can't tell their stories. And it's so critical to get those voices, the unheard voices out there. So thank you so much again. Now back to Van An. Now, one way to support the communities to bounce back after trauma or to become more resilient to climate change is to increase access to climate resilient livelihoods. And this is the very center of your work. So please share with us your experiences in supporting women's entrepreneurship in renewable energy to strengthen climate resilience. How have you implemented this, and what are the results so far? And what are some of your learnings and successes?
Thank you, Nadia. Now I look at the time, and I think I will try to keep it short.
Thank you.
Yes, this is exactly the question related to our work. I think to do so, we have involved the active participation from the women in all our research, assessment, project design, intervention design. So to identify the interest, issue, gap, challenges, and let them make decision on the solution that they selected and they prefer. The second one is that we involve all the traditional leader, normally is men, and government officer, also most of them are men in the whole process, to make sure that they recognize the value and the need, aspiration and expectation from the woman. And by that way, we change their perception about the woman role and leadership in the community. So we also, during the project implementation, we have a different result, and we use some kind of communication intervention to channel all our message about women, how their good work, how we can take a role that traditional consider as that man work, for example, to change the perception in the community. So, however, with quite a lot of work related to women empowerment, especially related to renewable energy under the Empower program, we found that the social exclusion and gender inequity, women in leadership is very challenging, and it requires a long-term support and more comprehensive measure than just short-term intervention in the community. For example, at the community, they consider renewable technology as something for men, at least in the ethnic minority community in Vietnam. So the way we try to build capacity for women to manage the renewable technology should be very good demonstration for the community to see how the women can manage work and how they can do the work and taking the leadership and bring a lot of income and efficiency of work. But until now, with different kind of work, it's still unclear to us how the very poor women, isolated people with disability, have a research and they can how they can access to the internet to get information about technology. So we think in the next step, what we need to do more deeply the community to target more vulnerable people with disability or very isolated women who do not have a smartphone to access to the internet, to make sure that they will not leave behind with the development of the community. Another thing is related to policy. I think Vietnam has some good law on gender law and gender-based violence law, but I don't think that we have a good mechanism to implement all that law. So I think we need to work with the provincial level and national level and how to integrating the law into agriculture sector to help the women, to empower them to lead in the change process in the community. So that's what I just very brief about what we are doing at the ground and some lessons learned that we need to take into consideration for follow-up action. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Van An. I'd now like to welcome back our high-level speaker, Professor Joyashree. Now, given your presentation on women's leadership in technology transfer and climate resilience, and some of the examples that we've been hearing from the ground from these speakers on women's empowerment, how do you see this as driving resilience building in the region?
As I mentioned, you know, that there are two sides of resilience building, that how you build the capacity of an individual to continue the functionality despite changes. So if we are seeing that there are going to be changes, say for example in the renewable energies, because if all energy is going to be renewable, let's assume this. So if this is the scenario going to be in next 10 years, then how all women can have access to that technology, which helps them to carry on their functionality. Say, for example, cooking. Say, for example, water heating. Say, for example, productive work. So, say in irrigation. So if I just look into just say these three things, then the question is women need to be trained from today itself at a very large scale to have access to these technologies and to show them how to operationalize this so that they do not lose their traditional livelihood, as well as they can adopt new livelihood. So this is something which is very important. So giving information to the women, which everybody said, that giving information to the women, targeting the women who are really, really left behind at the bottom of the pyramid, how do you reach out to them? So I can see that these are the various institutions like Energia and many others in Vietnam. They are trying to locate these communities who are at the bottom of the pyramid. And they are trying to see that how those stories, as Buena said, how those stories can be told in the newsroom and in the media every day, persistently, without acknowledging that there are other problems. This is also equally bigger problem. How do you really project it? So people like Buena has a very important role to play so that it goes to everybody to understand that this is a major problem, which is a persistent problem, which needs to be solved for bringing the community up to the level of a decent living. So from that point of view, I think this information, just not only about gender disaggregated data, what is the access, etc., but also that what are the changes they can make. So what is the new capacity building that is needed for them? So those identification of those and listing those so that there is investment in that. So there is training in that. This is something very important coming out from everyone. And everybody said that poverty is a real barrier, which means that economic empowerment is important. And this is nothing new news, you know. So this is, we know for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But then the question is, do we get a new chance now when we are talking of a new growth path? Can we build in a new paradigm where women can take the lead and go forward without falling behind? So the historical mistake of leaving women behind, how can we break that myth? This has become a myth, right? That women will be following the leaders, right? The societal leaders. But women becoming a leader, so creating role models, as all of you have said, the role models, you know, in the most backward community, how one is taking leadership in giving information, as Soma said, no, that through her network. And that value is no less than a television channel giving a mass media information, you know. So this is what she is doing, is targeted information. So I think they are our role models. We really need them almost every day to be showcased in the mass media, so that people can know that who are our leaders who are really changing the community, right? So I think this is something which is very important. So institutions' role is very important. And by institution, I just do not mean the government, but I also mean, like, say, institution like Energia, institution like the newsroom. So all these are different institutions. How we build this whole ecosystem where there is infrastructure, there is institution, there is finance, there is role model, all targeted to women. We really need that to be built. And we need database on that, good practices by women, led by women. And so these will help us. So really there is a huge focus. 50% of population are women, and we are neglecting. So basically we are losing out the productive role of these people. So how can we grow faster is really important. So I think what we started with, that institution, individual, and the infrastructure are very important, and they need to be women targeted, is even more established by these examples. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Roy. As with all of our speakers today, I just feel like we need more time. I'm not sure about those of the rest of us who are watching in, but I'm deeply curious. I'm so deeply curious about, I want to dive deeper, but we just unfortunately don't have the time. So please do look them up online and go and follow them on their LinkedIn, on their social media, so that you can always learn more. Now we have a final cross-cutting question here, and this goes out to all of our speakers. What action is the most critical in order to scale up the existing experiences with digital technologies, storytelling, and amplifying women's voice and leadership? I'd like to go through the speakers here. We'll start with Buena, please.
Strong nuanced storytelling, placing women front and center of the human experience, is critical in mainstreaming women's work in ensuring resilient communities, and critical in bridging the gap between the climate policy bubble and the general public. I believe that women's role as leaders in resilience building can be best articulated by the fact that it is the women in society who are disproportionately affected by climate change. So if we show that in our stories, it's easy for the audience to understand that women leaders are best positioned to address these gaps. And it's tempting to think there's no link between stories about women still in the margins and women who have quote unquote made it. But I think that it's an acknowledgement of the shared experience and long history of disadvantage. And the best way to communicate the need to empower women is to show those inherent disadvantages that other women still face. So we celebrate women because we know that their journey wasn't easy. And we celebrate equality in some respect because we know how unequal the world still is.
Thank you, Buena. Next up, Soma, please.
Thank you. So just starting with storytelling, one point I'd like to make is that storytelling when told by the women themselves, the women leader themselves, really, really works well. And we've taken, Energy has taken some of our entrepreneurs to, really high level forums like the Sustainable Energy for All Forum. And those were extremely effective. Coming now to the other side of data and information, I'd just like to say that data, of course, plays a very important role, but we really need to go beyond this binary data that we have. So we need to have simple but telling indicators that are able to capture women's multiple roles. That's one. The second also is to, we need to ensure that this kind of data collection, which goes beyond binary yes, no kind of matrix, actually gets incorporated into our country level data collection processes. So go beyond the single project collecting data, but ensure that this kind of data collection is actually done throughout countries, throughout all countries, in fact. And that gets systematized and institutionalized in the processes. And one final point I'd like to make is that there needs to be better connect between SDG 7, which is on energy, SDG 5, which is on gender, and all other SDGs. So the data collection and indicators also have to be developed in a manner that actually exemplifies and highlights these linkages. Thank you.
Thank you, Soma. And Van An?
Yes, thank you. I think our action from Vietnam is not new. It's already mentioned by Professor Roy, Burma, and Soma. It's very much similar. I think we need to documentation a good lesson learned and process of how women can do the technology and also the empower to take the leadership. I think we can say and communicate and advocacy at community level, provincial level, and national level to change the policy and policy implementation, because this is a big gap in Vietnam. But also it's very important that we need to build capacity for the women on communication skill, so she can go in different forum and group discussion, or to share and to influence other, including policy level and at the community level. And then when she come back to the community, she can lead the change process instead of GSA, because I'm sure we cannot stay forever in the community. So we need to build capacity to drive themselves the process of change. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Professor Roy?
You know what? I sometimes think that I cannot disagree with anyone, any point. They all have said what is needed. So if we add them together, exactly that's what we need, right? So basically but you know, all these actions need investment. So we need investors to look into these aspects. And there really lies that what we show that why investing, actually the society gets better value. So more research is needed to show that why investing in women brings in more value addition. And then communicating that to everybody, right? What is the new value addition that we get? I'll just give an example. Suppose when a company tries to promote a new edition of mobile phone, they just say that what is the new value addition you are getting. So if we are promoting that, this is something which is needed for the society, we need to show that value addition. So I would say our narrative need to change from telling the problem or the victimization story to the change maker story. I really like what Buena said, that an architect, she is more conscious about the nature. That's why she is building an architecture which saves the trees as well as gives the city's functionality. So make these stories within that framework, so that we really need the change framing, right? We need change framing the issue from victim to change maker, and then bring this in every day. How does a company sells its products? Every time, every 2 minutes, you get to see the advertisement, right? Either in a newspaper, in a television, or wherever. So we need those. So we need to reach out to masses, keep on telling that what are the value addition done by all these women. So bringing from grassroots to top, every sphere. So once you start showing, people will see that, oh, this is possible. This is happening. And then the taboo will go. So you rise above the cultural taboo. So how you rise above the cultural taboo? By showcasing that what is possible. So I think what is not happening, not showing that, what is happening and how this can be replicated. What process led to that? So telling the process which makes this possible, telling the story of Buena, telling the story of Nadia, these are important. We never tell these stories. Shoma, she said so articulate way, all the things. So we really need to make them the role models and tell their stories every day, everywhere.
Thank you so much, Professor Roy. So beautifully rounding up all of that there. We do have a few questions now. I'm not sure how many questions we will be able to get to, but I will just take a couple of questions here that have been sent to me by our team. The first question is to Buena. Could you please advise on how media could be used to communicate scientific data and evidence about impacts of climate change on women? Often it seems that the science does not reach the mainstream media channels. And this is a problem that I face all the time.
Well, I find that when I speak to scientists, it is very hard to get a succinct soundbite from them, which is really what broadcast news stations are looking for, right? The 30-second soundbite that kind of captures the entire point. And the reason why it's hard is because the science behind climate change and the solutions really are complicated, and it'll take more than just that 30-second soundbite. So I think that ties in to the earlier discussion on newsroom management, because if you're willing to give more than 3 minutes of airtime to this story, for example, then you will be in a better position to be able to explain the science behind it. But if you're going to use the standard, depends on the channel, but the standard 1 minute 30 seconds or 3 minute 30-second news report to explain, for example, this interview that I did about the Dasgupta review, to explain, how you should integrate indicators of saving the environment and biodiversity to the traditional indicators of growth, which is GDP, very much parallel to the economics of happiness we've seen in Bhutan, where she's discussing right now the economics of biodiversity. If you're just going to use the standard 1 minute, 30-second report for that, then maybe it'll be very hard to explain that to the general public. But again, if you have a newsroom management that's willing to maybe dedicate an entire segment, maybe even an entire show for the topic of climate change, then you're in a better position to explain that to the general public. And I think that's why I pinpoint that as the most important success factor in trying to make sure that stories reach the masses through mass media. It's that newsroom decision, that allocation of time, resources, and including airtime for stories that matter, but are really not part of the news cycle.
Thank you, Buena. In the interest of time, there are a few questions that have been sent to the panelists that have been posted in the Q&A function in Zoom. So please, for the panelists, do have a look in there and try to answer some of the questions if you can. And I have one last question here to Soma, if you could answer just briefly, and then I'll have a wrap up. We only have like 4 minutes left. Soma, I have seen countries led by women leaders are taking more serious attentions to trauma by CC and DRR, and are also current COVID-19 situation. Have you ever witnessed that having more women in decision-making levels and leadership positions helped to publicly discuss and bring out the trauma, especially for women in marginalized groups? That's for Soma.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we've seen this multiple times in multiple questions, but of course, what it also means is that the participation must go beyond tokenism. So you need action to build leadership at several levels when you're working on climate, especially on seemingly technical issues like climate change, renewable energy. Then it's always a very good idea to take, for example, the Ministry of Women and Children's Affairs along to build their capacity. When you bring women leaders or community leaders, then you also have to train them, or you have to build their capacity to be able to speak in the same language that others do. Similarly, when you're working with the energy sector leaders, it's very, very important, like Buena said, to have a 30-second soundbite, which explains the crux at least of what you want to say, and at least get them interested enough. So these are some things work, but as far as getting women on the table with a meaningful voice, with a convincing voice, works very well, always.
Thank you so much, Soma. Now, to wrap up our conversation today, it's been so rich and also diverse and so informative. And from Professor Roy, we particularly loved the narrative of, or changing the narrative, or change framing the victim story to being rather to being a change maker, right? And Soma's key action is to develop simple yet telling indicators that capture women's multiple roles as users of energy services, managers of community resources, entrepreneurs, employees, and community leaders. Buena's key action is more strong, nuanced storytelling, placing women at the front and center of the human experience and leadership in ensuring resilient communities. We celebrate women because we know their journey wasn't a breeze, and we celebrate equality in some respect because we know how unequal our world still is. And Van Ann's key action is to increase the capacity amongst women on RE technology expertise from the community perspective. This will really increase the resilience and would increase women's social status and leadership. I'd like to thank the organizers of today's session, UNEP and UN Women under the Empower Project, funded by the government of Sweden. If you would like to learn more about the Empower Project, please visit empowerforclimate.org, where the key summaries of this discussion will be made available. I'm Nadia Hutsagalung, and it has been such an honor and a pleasure to be your moderator today. And I'm so grateful for all of our panelists. I might even be reaching out to you for more information myself. Thank you all so much, and enjoy your almost weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. Please join us for the next technical sessions beginning at 2 p.m. Bangkok time, focusing on nature-based and economic sector resiliences. You can find a link to join these sessions by returning to the Sessions tab on the APAN Forum Conference community on Kubilo. Within the community, you can also explore the exhibitions as well as chat or set up meetings with other conference attendees. Join the conversation on social media using the hashtag APAN2020. Thank you once again for your participation and see you in the next sessions.